Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on rare Turkish tanks and armored fighting vehicles of the Second World War. Now, during World War II, Turkey largely remained neutral, but did have a large number of armored fighting vehicles that Ankara had accumulated over the years before and during the Second World War. Now, when World War II began on the 1st of September 1939, Turkey declared neutrality, not siding with either the Axis or the Allied powers. But eventually, on February the 23rd, 1945, Turkey eventually did enter World War II on the Allied side after being bribed by both the United States and the United Kingdom, or Great Britain. But during the time period between 1939 and 1945, Turkey had purchased a variety of armored fighting vehicles from both the Allied and Axis powers. So let's go over some of the rare tanks that were used by the Turkish army during World War II, and some of the foreign tanks that were purchased by the Turks during the Second World War also. But first, let's go over one of the rarest Turkish tanks that was actually produced during the Second World War. And that tank was the Ii Caracalla from 1943. Now, this was actually two separate tanks according to my sources, but it is usually listed as one tank. Now, this vehicle's main armament was largely unknown. It was either one 7.92mm or 7.65mm Turkish Vickers machine gun, or it could have been one 37mm Poltex SA-18 FT-17 main gun, as Turkey did have some leftover FT-17s, or it could have been one 25mm French-made Hotchkiss M1939 tank gun, the same tank gun used on some of the French armored cars and light tanks during the Battle of France in 1940. Now, keep in mind, Turkey actually did purchase some French light tanks before and during World War II. The armor thickness of this vehicle was between 3 and 11mm, and its speed was 35 kilometers per hour or 22 miles per hour, and it had a crew of between 2 and 3. Now, the Ii Caracalla was actually based, or was simply a Turkish-made copy of the Soviet T-37A. The T-37A was a Soviet amphibious light tank produced in the mid to late 1930s, and Turkey actually received at least 2 or 3 of these vehicles. One vehicle was officially sent, but there are some sources that state that Turkey received 2 or 3. This tank was actually produced by the Turkish Machine and Chemical Plant, also known as the Kırıkkale factory, in 1943 as a way of Turkey trying to produce its own tanks and own armored fighting vehicles. But ultimately, Turkey gave up on the project by 1945 and began to import even more foreign tanks for the most part. Now, some sources state that there was a second version of the MKE, and this was a medium tank that had sloped armor, and it resembled either a T-34 or a German Panzer III tank. Keep in mind, Turkey did purchase tanks from the Soviet Union and also from Germany, and this secondary tank was said to have a main armament of either one 76mm gun or a 76mm gun and 40mm gun in one turret. But I haven't been able to find any photographic evidence of the second prototype of the Ii Caracalla. So this one amphibious light tank prototype seems to be the only one that actually existed. And this was the only real armored fighting vehicle that was designed by the Turks, even though it was just a copy of the Soviet T-37A. The Ii Caracalla was not the only tank in Turkish service during the Second World War. In the years before World War II, Turkey had actually purchased tanks from a variety of different countries, and the first country to sell tanks to Turkey was actually France. Turkey and France had actually fought each other temporarily during the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 through 1922, but in 1927, France decided to sell tanks to Turkey anyway, and these tanks were the Renault FT-17 type. 100 Renault FT-17 tanks were sold to Turkey in 1928, but Turkey had already captured 7 Renault FT-17 from the French forces during the Greco-Turkish War in 1919-1922. So in total, Turkey had 107 Renault FT-17s that were still being used as either training tanks or infantry support tanks during the Second World War. The next country to sell tanks to Turkey was the Soviet Union. Now, during the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet Union wanted to turn Turkey into either an allied or a satellite state. So the Soviet Union began selling tanks and armored cars to the Turkish Republic. And the first tanks to be purchased by Turkey were the T26 Light Tanks, which were purchased from the USSR in 1935. In total, Turkey purchased 60 of these light infantry tanks, and they served in the Turkish army all the way up until the year 1950, where they were finally replaced by the American M46 and later M48 Patton series of main battle tanks. So these T26 light tanks were actually the backbone of the Turkish army, at least up until the end of the Second World War. Along with the T26, the Turks also received 60 Soviet-made BA-6 and BA-3 series of heavy turreted armored cars. Now, these were some of the heaviest armored cars produced by the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and Turkey also purchased some of these along with the T-26 light tanks. And these were the first true armored cars to serve in the Turkish army post-World War I. And these vehicles also served all the way up until at least the end of World War II, where they were finally replaced by light tanks purchased from the US and Great Britain. Also in the year 1935, Turkey also purchased 5 British-made Carden Lloyd tankets from the UK. Now these were light tankets. These tankets were also used by Greece at the same time period. These 5 light tankets were mostly used as training vehicles and parade vehicles, but they were still listed as in service during the Second World War era. Along with Great Britain, France continued to sell tanks to Turkey. In February 1940, a few months before the fall of France, France sold another 100 Charles Leger Renault R-35 light tanks. Now, these light tanks were meant to replace the older FT-17s that were purchased by Turkey in 1928. And these were the same light tanks that France used against Germany when Germany invaded France in 1940. And these tanks also served up until the 1950s before being replaced by Cold War era American and British hardware. Along with the French R-35s, the British also sold 16 Vickers Armstrong 6-ton Mark A light tanks in 1940, also during the same time period as the German invasion of mainland Europe. These light tanks were these were twin-turreted light tanks fitted with machine guns, and they also served in the Turkish army during the Second World War. Now, during World War II, the Axis powers also tried to bribe Turkey into joining their side during the war, and the first and only country to do this was Germany. In January 1943, Germany had actually sold 22 Panzer III Model M medium tanks with the 50mm KWK 39/L60 main guns to Turkey starting in January 1943 all the way up until March 1943. Then later on, in 1944, Germany also sold some Panzer IV Model G and H series of medium tanks to Turkey between late 1943 and May 1944. And these were the Panzer IV tanks fitted with the 75mm gun. And these tanks actually served in the Turkish army all the way up until the early Cold War era, at least up until the mid-1950s. And you can still see these tanks today at some of the Turkish armor museums. In 1942, Turkey also purchased some Vickers Armstrong Valentine infantry tanks from Great Britain, and there were 220 of these light/medium infantry tanks in the Turkish army, and they were purchased between 1942 and 1944, making the Vickers Armstrong's Valentine infantry tank the most common tank in the Turkish army post-1944. Turkey also purchased American M. Stuart light tanks. Now, these were actually the British manufactured version of the M3 Stuart light tanks, nicknamed the Honey, and these were also purchased between 1942 and 1944, along with the Valentine infantry tanks. And then finally, in January 1945, the U.S. also bribed Turkey with 34 M4 Sherman medium tanks. Now, these were some of the later production models. These were the same M4 Shermans that served during the Normandy campaign in 1944, and the United States sold 34 of these M4 Shermans to Turkey in January 1945, just a few weeks before Turkey finally declared war on the Axis powers in February 1945. So many historians consider these M4 Shermans, along with other weapons, to be the United States bribing Turkey into joining the Allied powers, which they did less than a month later. So these were pretty much the Turkish armored fighting vehicles of the Second World War. The Ii Caracalla was the only tank prototype designed by the Turks during the Second World War. And like I said, there is a rumor that there was a second version, a medium tank with sloped armor that resembled a T-34 that was also produced by Turkey between 1943 and 1945. And that second version was said to have been unveiled at the Republican Day ceremony in 1946. But I haven't been able to find any photographs of the second prototype of the Ii Caracalla, and that was a medium tank prototype. But that's pretty much it. Which of these vehicles were your favorite? Obviously, the Ii Caracalla is my favorite of all the Turkish vehicles that were in service or designed during the Second World War. But please tell me in the comment section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.